Hello, friends. Welcome to this episode of Writers Talk Classical Education, a capsule podcast. I'm joined here today by my longtime friend and family member, Winston Brady. Winston is the Director of Curriculum and Thales Press at Thales Academy, a network of classical schools with campuses in North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and South Carolina. A graduate of the College of William and Mary, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and the Keenan Flagler School of Business at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Winston writes on the intersection of history, politics, and culture, as seen through the lens of classical wisdom and virtue. He lives in North Carolina with his wife Rachel of 10 years and his three boys Hunter, Jack, and Samuel, all of whom will one day learn Latin. Welcome, Winston. Thanks for coming to talk to us today about using rhetoric and seminar in a classical education.
Thank you so much for having me, Holly. I really appreciate the invitation.
Well, Winston, I have a question to ask you to get started. What is your education journey? Were you classically educated?
I was very privileged and very blessed to have had a classical education. I grew up in the DC area. So Northern Virginia, it's the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And from 7th grade up through 12th grade, I went to an all-boys private school called Landon. It employs a classical curriculum. So I did get to read the great books. I also started taking Latin in my 7th grade year. In the kind of classical schools and classical programs that you and I moved through, classical conversations, Thales Academy, like-minded homeschooling programs, private schools, and charter schools. A lot of times we speak of a classical resurgence or a renewal in classical education, because in a very real sense, we are bringing something back, something that was, lost for at least one generation, if not more, here in the United States. The intellectual inheritance, the great works, the great books, the great writings from poets like Homer and Virgil and Dante, those books were really just removed from American public schools for a generation. I'm very blessed, though, very unique in that I did have a classical education. And some of these private schools in the DC area, as well as New England and New York, they've always had classical education. There's no renewal up there. What's really amazing about the renewal movement in some of these charter schools and private schools is they're not necessarily bringing something back, but they're bringing something that previously was reserved for really the elites, the crust of society, people who were blessed with the means in order to have this sort of education. And so, at Thales Academy, where I work, we're really trying to make that sort of education available for as many people as we can get to our schools. In a sense, we're really democratizing it, but in a good way. We're making an education founded on the values and virtues, timeless wisdom, academic rigor, really great books, Latin. I do love Latin. We're trying to make that available for as many kids as possible as can come through our school. So favorite class, 11th grade, humanities. It was philosophy for the first 50 minutes, and then it was literature for the next 50 minutes. The way the class was structured, we read Plato and we read Homer. We read Virgil and we read Cicero. And we just kind of moved steadily through the ages until we got to the present day. So I would really credit that class in particular for some really good, positive, profound changes in my life. Chief amongst them, just finding out what Christianity really was, which I found out in a footnote to Dante's Inferno.
No way.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it was Dante's Inferno. It's the first canto in Dante's three-part series. In Italian, it's the Commedia. If the three parts is in English, it's a lot of times it's called the Divine Comedy. Comedy is structured in such a way that you start from a place of great misery and misfortune, and through the course of whatever kind of literary work it is, the protagonist ends in great happiness and good fortune. So the idea is that you're starting from a bad place and you're ending up in a good place. And if you think about any comedies that you particularly like, they're typically structured like that. The protagonist loses and loses and loses, and then finally they win at the end and everybody's happy. Dante, it's the same sort of thing, except that he starts out in hell, the very worst place that you can possibly get, struggling with depression, perhaps struggling with suicide, thoughts of suicide. But he goes through the circles of the Inferno, going through the very worst of what humanity has to offer. And then the second canto, the second poem in the Commedia is Purgatorio. So he's going through purgatory. And in Roman Catholic theology, sins are being burned off and cleansed. In the Inferno, they're being punished because those souls are tragically cut off from God. In the Purgatorio, the shades are being cleansed of their sins. And then the last canto is Paradiso, where Dante meets with the saints who are enthroned with God and enjoying God's presence for all eternity. So there's the comedic structure to it, starting off in the Inferno, the very worst, ending up in Paradiso, the very best. But I just remember reading a footnote. It was linked to a verse in the Sermon on the Mount. Look at the lilies of the field, how they toil not, neither do they spin, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Moments like that were really my first real experience with Christianity. So when we talk about the transformative nature of a classical education, I can think back to that one very profound moment where something I read really did arrest me, grab my attention, and focus it on something profoundly good, the likes of which I really hadn't encountered. My parents did, take me to church as a kid, and so that's when Christianity started to become just a little bit more real.
That's
So,
neat.
yeah.
That is so neat. It was like you had to discover it almost.
Yeah, and perhaps discover, I think, is the best way, because if the times that my parents took me to church, times that my parents took me to Sunday school, if it's forced, you may not want to listen to it all that carefully. If it's forced, you may be kind of, skeptical and so forth. But if you discover it for yourself, and then it's got a lot more meaning and value to it. I had a podcast interview with Ravi Jain a few weeks ago, and he made that point. Students aren't going to learn anything that's forced. Nothing stays in the mind that's forced. And the ironic thing is, in education, we have so many buzzwords for basically cajoling, forcing, kids to learn stuff. Even the word pedagogy, it comes from a Greek word that means driver of children, pedagogos. That was the tutor that Roman and Greek, definitely Roman kids, I'm not sure if it's Greek, but definitely Roman kids had, who taught them their grammar and their letters and their Roman literature. So pedagogos, a driver of children. That's where we get the word pedagogy from.
Wow.
And just goes on like that. Curriculum, for instance, curriculum means racetrack.
Okay. Has some kind of root in there that's kind of circular or something like that? Or am I wrong? Course?
It just means racetrack.
That's interesting.
If we think about it, what we do every year, we're just kind of running on a racetrack.
Yeah.
And when the year starts over, we just start running again.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's interesting. Well, I think it's interesting that you were able to kind of through your classical education, kind of discover more of Christianity. And just thinking about classical education, if you could tell us a little bit about, from what I know about classical education, we have something called the Trivium, right? And there are three basic, what are they called? I don't want to say stages. Is that the right word to use for Trivium?
Well, it comes from a Latin word, tri, meaning three, like triceratops or tricycle. And then via, which means way or road. So smash those two words together and you get tri-via or trivium. And it's like the three ways or the three roads that are supposed to culminate in a person of great education and learning.
Okay. So speak on that a little bit, because I would love to ask you, my only familiarity with the Trivium right now is what they call the grammar stage. And later we have the dialectic, and then we'll talk about rhetoric.
Yeah.
What exactly is your understanding of how those three ways progress or act together?
Yeah. So Trivium is not a medieval outlook on education, but is an outlook of education from the medieval period. It's the way that medieval scholastics organized the training up of plucky young youths that were privileged to receive an education. It's meant to be the ways of thinking, the arts of thinking, and it's something of a foundation, the starting place for people. They have to learn how to think before they go on and do more advanced coursework. I've always gotten different answers to this question when kids go through the Trivium. Brian Williams at Templeton Honors College said they'd probably finish it, the 3 ways of grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric by the time they're 13 or 14. The thinking, though, is that you start off, and you don't necessarily start at, you're only doing grammar and you're not doing logic or rhetoric. But you're also not necessarily doing all 3 of them at once. But the more you know, the easier I feel it is to develop these arts of thinking in yourself as well as in students. So it's so grammar is really the rules of communication. So those fundamental, punctuation, syntax, as well as just ways of reading and writing. So the rules that govern communication. Logic, coming from the Greek word logos, for reasoning, reckoning, or account. There, we're talking about the rules to organize arguments, to organize large swaths of information, as well as the ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Descartes in Discourse on Method identifies that as one, not necessarily a purpose of logic, but just of common sense and thinking in general. And reason, a purpose of reason, is to distinguish truth from error. And in Aristotle's Rhetoric, he describes rhetoric as the counterpart to logic. So it's not something that's, you start doing once you've mastered logic. It's something that you're by and large doing in and along at the same time as you're learning logic. So logic, you're putting together arguments, and you can distinguish between deductive arguments and inductive arguments, and we can talk about that later. That's fun. But rhetoric is the ability to take all the things that you've learned already, the rules of communication and the rules of argumentation, and to put those together in such a way that you can create and compose a really stirring speech, because that's really what rhetoric is at the heart about. The rules of public speaking, the strategies for public speaking, and the ability for somebody in a position of responsibility that they can marshal arguments together the way that a soldier might organize their troops on the battlefield. You understand the best course of action, the plan that is going to accomplish your goal. And this goal really has good, positive benefits for the people that you're speaking to. And you are composing a speech in such a way as to win them over. And Quintilian, and he's got this wonderful book. You can't read it all at once. It's about 600 pages. Andrew Kern gives this tip in his webinar on rhetoric, but maybe read like 15 minutes at a time or something like that. But Quintilian's got this really great book. It's one of the only books on education that we have from the ancient world. As far as like running a classroom and structuring curriculum, Quintilian lived from 35 AD to 100 AD, really brilliant guy. Engaging writer, but he writes on the ideal orator, and he describes that individual as a man of great virtue, an individual of great virtue, who is committed to pursuing the good and can weave that into his speeches. So I'd have to find the quote, but when he talks about the ideal orator, it's someone who has every excellence of mind. And even just that idea there, it's not just their knowledge of the humanities, but also the knowledge of the sciences and also really good character to accompany that. So,
I think I read a little bit about Quintilian in your book, Research and Writing, Starting to Write, put out by Thales Press right here. Got it.
Oh, my word. You're so kind. I
it's
love
really interesting. I mean, it really does help kind of give you an idea of how to express your ideas in a very convincing way, but it starts kind of incrementally. You have a lot of different parts to this, like chapter 1, rhetoric, chapter 2, the thesis statement, chapter 3, the writing process, and it goes on. And there's just so much in here. So I think I remember that quintillion quote from maybe this book, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah, it's from the opening paragraphs and on the education of an orator.
Okay. Well, I'll look for it right here in a second. I just wanted to give you here's another interesting quote from somebody a little more from modern times, G.K. Chesterton. He has a quote on Aristotle, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it as it relates to rhetoric. He said, Aristotle anticipated more fully the sacramental sanity that was to combine the body and the soul of things. For he considered the nature of men as well as the nature of morals, and looked to the eyes as well as to the light. Can you maybe break that down a little bit for some of our listeners and for me?
Yeah. Well, Aristotle lived during the late 300s BC. So as far as like the progression, of like the family tree of early Greek philosophers, you have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Aristotle was the student of Plato in the same way that Plato was the student of Socrates. Aristotle has treatises on of an intellectual, of a scientist, is how inquisitive he is. And so he's always asking questions in the same way that Socrates is asking questions in Plato's dialogues. To go along with that, Aristotle does a lot of observations and like research out in the field. There's a good book that he writes called On the Generation of Animals. The Generation of Animals is Aristotle like intently watching animals out in the wild and writing down what he sees. So all sorts of really cool insights into octopi living along the coastline of Macedon. I forget where he wrote a lot of the stuff. I believe it was while he was still in Macedon. It might have been during a brief period when he had left Plato's Academy and he went back home. He's originally from Macedon. He also tutored Alexander the Great, which is a really cool kind of Chiron-esque moment in world history. Chiron being that centaur that tutored Hercules and Achilles. But I think that's where G.K. Chesterton is getting this insight about that Aristotle considered the nature of men as well as the nature of morals. Aristotle has a strong sense of the ideal and what constitutes the nature of the good, and that people really should focus their attention on things of enduring value. The Nicomachean Ethics is just a beautiful exposition on the nature of the good life and the kinds of activities that constitute the good life. At the same time, though, Aristotle, being so inquisitive and research focused, spent a lot of time just observing people as they were. So spending lots of time in the Acropolis, spending lots of time in the assembly in Athens, hearing people give speeches, watching plays, participating in the life of the polis, and just seeing, people watching and seeing what people do and asking questions about why they do it. And so while he's got a very high sense of what man could be, what man should be, pursuing the nature of the good life, I think Aristotle also has a lot of data and reference points for just how depraved and terrible people can really act when they're motivated by more base pursuits, such as for Aristotle, the goods that he deals with. Most people are seeking after money or perhaps honor and praise and esteem. Some people are pursuing pleasures, which he ranks very low because animals also pursue pleasure. Aristotle says that you should really pursue the life of the mind, and you should pursue virtue and wisdom in accordance with reason, and that's like the nature of the good life. We're using our God-given faculties to know stuff, and that's what God has given our faculties to do, to know things, to seek those things out. But he also has, Aristotle has wonderful observations of demagogues hiking up their skirts, hiking up their togas, and running around the Athenian assembly, shouting curse words and insults and things like that, and trying to grab people's attention and win them over to their side. So I think that's what G.K. Chesterton is getting at. But his writing is so paradoxical and just hard to untangle, that it. I don't think I can never do G.K. Chesterton justice unless, he's just a brilliant, brilliant guy. But I think that's what he's getting at. What do you think? You know G.K. Chesterton a lot better than I do.
Given my limited understanding and knowledge of Aristotle, see, I wouldn't say I was classically educated. And even a study of the history was very much kind of like flyover. So I think he really is probably just focusing on the absolute truth. And I mean, I'm giving my best guess based on what I've read of G.K. Chesterton and what I know of G.K. Chesterton, talking about there is an absolute truth. And, in his world, his postmodern world, G.K. Chesterton's, postmodernism was taking off, modernism and postmodernism. And there was kind of this nihilism, around his time period too, just like, what is truth? What does it even matter? And like, there wasn't a pursuit of absolute truth in some of these modes of thinking or these movements. In the arts, it was like, we draw this cow. We're drawing a cow, but all we have to do is draw the purple line and call it a cow or whatever. There's a quote about that. So he takes that, and he's very very much of the belief that there exists an absolute truth, and there is absolute good and evil. And I think that when he talks about Aristotle, he, in very general terms, is saying, like, well, in my general terms, I interpret that to mean he's saying Aristotle was able to see like the outside source of truth, not just like what's in man and what he observed in man, but the fact that there is an outside source emanating this light that we can all kind of see if, just if we behold that instead of just focusing on what we believe to be our truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Aristotle famously has an argument for God and God's existence, but it's independent of and apart from the Bible. It comes in book 12 of the Metaphysics, but it's the argument for the unmoved mover. Your listeners, perhaps, like, people listening at home, just imagine a circle, and the circle is in constant motion, but really you need something outside that causal chain of being that kickstarts the motion, the movement in that and so forth. And that's what Aristotle identifies that being as the prime mover, the unmoved mover, this entity that's able to kickstart all the other motion, all the other movement that we see in the universe around us. The only problem with that is the unmoved mover doesn't seem to be very like personal or relational. I think this is just a wonderful, like the way that Christianity, the medieval scholastics, individuals like Augustine and Aquinas, they could see Greek wisdom, what is effectively pagan wisdom, and Aristotle comes with this idea for God, but it's not the same as the God of the Bible, and it's not relational. It doesn't talk. It can't identify with your suffering and hardships. Aquinas reads Aristotle and he just takes, the next logical step, which is, the unmoved mover, this is the being, this is the person that the Bible identifies as God.
Yeah.
What's glorious about that too is that it's, a being that you can have a relationship with. It'd be the same with the forms in Plato, the form of the good, the form of beauty, the form of justice. Forms don't talk. It's,
True. That's true. I like it. Being able to take that, but also knowing what, through our Christian worldview, what the truth actually is, but being able to see that they glimpsed like shadows of that, even though they may not have attributed it to the one true God. So that's interesting. So I know we touched on rhetoric with Aristotle. What did Aristotle, I was reading in your resource, the writing resource, it talks a little bit about Aristotle and modes of persuasion. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Aristotle in Rhetoric, so he writes these treatises that their titles are reflect whatever the subject matter that he's writing on. His students, who are named the Peripatetics, wrote down his lectures and edited them later on. But in Rhetoric, he's writing down the fruits of his observations in the Athenian assembly, hearing people give speeches. And he boils down all of the effective speeches. What made them effective is that they employed one of three types of these modes of persuasion. So there is an appeal to pathos, which is an appeal to the emotions. There's an appeal to logos, which is the appeal to logic or reason. And then there's the appeal to ethos, which is the appeal really based on one's character, both in terms of how you appear in front of an audience, as well as how your reputation before you came up to start speaking. And Aristotle walks through those three types of ways of making an appeal. So in Rhetoric, that's like the walks through those three different types of appeals in Rhetoric. The emotion. Do you want me to go into more detail there? I feel like I'm talking so much, Holly. I'm so sorry.
Don't apologize. I love this. This is like a class for me to sit down and hear, and I'm sure our listeners would agree. So yeah, keep talking, and then we'll move into maybe Socratic seminar, just very briefly touch on that.
Okay. So amongst the modes of persuasion, the most popular and effective are going to be emotional appeals. People tend to be swayed by their emotions, moved to action by their emotions, far more so than appeals to the head, to logical appeals. If you've ever read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, you can think about Mr. Collins's appeal to Elizabeth Bennet. He lays out this very logical argument about why they should get married. He has a very wealthy patroness, Miss Catherine de Bourgh. He has a salary as a minister. And of course, he's set to inherit the Bennet family estate. And so for all these reasons, we should get married. And of course, like in a marriage proposal, you don't want a logical appeal. You want a lot of heart. You want to appeal to the love that you have for the lady that you're proposing to, and so forth. Like the proposal from Mr. Collins is just kind of a joke in that way. Emotional appeals, though, can be very dangerous. And Aristotle distinguishes between good emotions and bad emotions, which is something I try to highlight with students. You can appeal to the envy of your audience. You can appeal to their rage and their suspicion. You can appeal to their enmity, right? How much they may not like a rival city-state. If you're trying to encourage them to go to war, you can appeal to their greed or their malice, all sorts of things, right? And we can kind of look back on the 20th century and see demagogues, dictators, evil men like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini really making the same sorts of rhetorical appeals to the people that they spoke to and led to great ruin. On the other hand, like Aristotle distinguishes, there are good emotions. There are good emotions that you can appeal to, and there are good ends that you can move to using such good emotional appeals. So in that particular book, Research and Writing, I have Henry V, the Crispin Day speech, William Shakespeare's
Yes.
Henry V.
Yes, we just learned about that in our school. Huh.
Yeah, I love that. I love that play. It's my favorite Shakespeare play, but
Mhm.
the Crispin's Day speech, he's appealing to their sense of honor, and
Mhm.
honor is a good thing. We want a good reputation, their desire for glory, and glory is not a bad thing, right? I mean, you can pursue it immoderately or through the bad means, but they're stuck there in France. They may as well like fight with everything they got. They're not going to get home otherwise.
Mhm.
Appealing to their to a sense of brother, comradeship, you know, warrior brotherly bond sort of thing. That's a nice theme throughout literature, going back to Homer and the Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. So he makes appeals that are themselves good. He's trying to inspire his troops to go into a battle that, for all intents and purposes, they should have lost. They were outnumbered by the French. They were fighting on foreign soil, and the French were heavily armored. It just so happened that God made it rain the night before, and so the French armor didn't count for anything.
Mm.
They couldn't maneuver through the mud and the muck and so forth. And also the English longbow was a game changer that the French just stubbornly refused to adapt to. But I love those sorts of rhetorical appeals. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he who sheds his blood with me this day shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And for whatever reason, I can't remember to the ending of the world. It's just so
Yeah.
great. It really stirs the heart.
Oh, and he kind of insults like the noblemen back in their beds,
Yeah.
like which is like, you guys are doing the honorable thing. You're with me, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he
Hold
feels,
their manhoods cheap,
yeah.
he says.
It
Yeah. It's a
reminds me
great
of the
line.
Braveheart speech, right? Is that
Mm.
kind of paralleling that? I don't know, but
I'm sure Mel Gibson or whoever wrote the script for Braveheart was definitely thinking of that, because
yeah.
that's just kind of but yeah, that's another good one, a stunning upset and the kind of speech that you would need to give in order to bring about that upset.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool. There's so much we could talk about in terms of modes of persuasion and all of that. But okay, I have to ask. Okay, so I say I wasn't classically educated, but I do remember in 10th grade, my English teacher had us um, circle up and do a Padilla Socratic, I guess, seminar. And I will never forget that. So Winston, was that a classical education method? And what makes that an integral part of classical education? I was talking about how I had remembered, I thought I wasn't classically educated, and by and large, I don't think I really was. But I do remember when I was in 10th grade, my English teacher got us into formation for a Padilla seminar. I guess, is that a Socratic seminar? And if so, um, was that, did I actually have some element of classical education in my background? And how is Socratic seminar an integral part of a classical education?
Well, would you say that your teacher was really excited about what they were teaching?
I would say she was passionate about it.
And were you guys reading something? What were you guys reading?
Oh, we had read a book, and I'm trying to remember. It might have been, well, I'm not sure if it was a speech or a book. This was English class. I think it could have been any number of things. We read The Hunchback of Notre Dame. We read the Phantom of the Opera. We had some more modern literature that we read, like Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. We read Night by Elie Wiesel. So not really classic or classical era works.
I mean, I would say yes. As far as I understand it, Padilla is, let me Google that. That should come. Do they use the word Padilla?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yes.
I'd say that individual had really done their homework, and I would say that if your teacher was really passionate about walking students through a really good, engaging, content-rich text,
Mm-hmm.
and was trying to lead you guys to discover the transformative ideas contained within those texts, discovering those ideas for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that is, elements of a classical education. Um, and that whole piece of that's such a good, expansive question.
Because some of
Sorry.
our listeners might have had some elements of classical education in their background, but I mean, when you asked me in your interview on my background, I did not think I had any kind of classical education in my history. But upon further recollection, I was like, oh, wait, I do think that Padilla seminar was very classical-esque, if not classical. But yeah, so anyway, that was kind of an aside. But I was going to ask you about Socratic seminar since you write about it, and since I think Thales Academy practices that. Um, how would you describe that as an integral part of a classical education?
Well, the but seminar teaching is uh, one pedagogical tool that a good teacher that is intent on filling their students' minds with good things can use in the classroom. The idea is to get students talking, but have that conversation guided by a really good book, a really good piece of literature, or perhaps a good piece of art. And the idea is to use that particular element of human culture as a means of getting people talking and getting them excited about ideas that are true and lasting and of great importance. A lot of times we use the adjective Socratic to describe Socratic seminars, and it's just dating back to Socrates, that 5th century Athenian philosopher who went around Athens asking people questions about the nature of wisdom, the nature of virtue, the nature of goodness, and trying to encourage his listeners to take ideas and their character and their choices far more seriously than they were. They're kind of drifting through life like, crabs drifting with the tide. A seminar in a classroom, it can look really different depending on the subject matter, the type of school that you have going on there, the number of kids in your classroom, and the grade level, like what's appropriate. I think in the earlier grade levels, it's better to, text should be shorter. They should probably be a little fantastical in the sense of, reading Aesop's fables, some stories that can catch students' imaginations. Honestly, it's probably really similar to the way you and I read to our kids at home. We try to find books that we find as interesting as we hope our kids are going to find them. And we try to ask good questions that really hit at some important moral or principle, or, just something that was really beautiful and delightful about the book. You can also add to that paintings, works of music. But I think at the heart of it is just asking good questions that are meant to lead the student to a deeper contemplation of ideas that matter. So, I mean, bringing it back to that teacher that had various seminars in your class wholeheartedly, like that's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
Although you can't do that like every single day. You do mix that in with the occasional test, lectures, other, and lectures should still be dynamic. You should still ask questions of students and get, a lot of engagement going and excitement, enthusiasm, even while you lecture. It just shouldn't be like a dry, boring, put the kids to sleep.
Yeah.
Sometimes I try to think of it as more of on the part of the teacher, it's more of the hard attitude. You really want the students to come to a deeper understanding of this particular book and why it matters for their life, as well as some of the difficult. You do have a book in front of you. The book is probably going to be pretty difficult to read. If it's a 10th grade English class, like you had mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
Victor Hugo, those books are long. Passages sometimes can feel as if they're never going to end. At Thales, we read medieval literature, so Beowulf and Dante's Inferno, uh, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So some of those works there have so many allusions, so many references, so many elements of nuanced language that the teacher really has to be there to help guide the students through that difficult text. But that's also job security for us. We really need to be there, and that's how we make our money, is by talking and pointing out to students really cool things along the way as they make it through the dark, tangled forest of a really good, engaging work of literature.
Do you think, kind of an aside question, but do you think that this Socratic seminar could be implemented in a like homeschool co-op? Do children have to be divided into age groups, uh, that kind of thing, separated if it's even feasible in a smaller group of like say 25 children?
I think depending on the vehicle, like what what you would use in order to guide that discussion. I think of the book in question as kind of a guide. It's a vehicle for exploring a particular idea or concept. 25 students is what I'm used to teaching middle school and high school. And so the numbers isn't beyond the pale. It's not crazy. Age levels may be kind of difficult because, like you and I, we both have small kids, various ages. I've got 7, 4, and almost 2. And the 7-year-old and the 4-year-old rarely, if ever, agree on the same books. And the 2-year-old never agrees on the same books.
No.
So, and sometimes they kind of, they swap alliances. The 7-year-old wants to read to the 2-year-old. The
Oh, wow.
4-year-old wants to sit in my lap while I read to the 2-year-old.
There you go.
Yeah. So I think that might be an area of difficulty to try to encourage seminar teaching. But you could also do a painting, and in that case, you don't have any reading to do. If you wanted it to be, and Charlotte Mason already does a lot of elements like that, where,
Yeah.
we're going to, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And so on. Really good. That's definitely the heart of what seminar teaching is. You're using that really rich element of human culture, using that as a vehicle to talk about really good, engaging ideas that help us, find our purpose, help us live better lives, help us make better choices.
I like that a lot. I think that what you said about even a piece of music, a piece of art, a painting or a piece of music, you can draw those things out of children and kind of guide them and act more as a facilitator, I suppose, in that kind of format.
Mm-hmm.
For the younger kids, and I guess for the older kids, you could find maybe a really good, book to read together and then come back and discuss it and touch on some themes. Yeah, that's a new concept to me, but I would really find it fascinating if it could be implemented in some kind of co-op scenario, maybe differentiated for different age levels and that kind of thing. But so thanks for sharing about Socratic seminar. And I know that classical education is kind of your bread and butter. This is what you are in, day in and day out at Thales. In your opinion, what is, I know we talked a little bit about, you know, teaching from a humble heart and, not just putting one method of education on a pedestal, but knowing that classical education is something that is quite different from what you might find in a traditional K-12 classroom. What, in your opinion, is the unique importance or unique difference of a classical education?
I'd say it's the density, the concentration of transformative ideas that are found in a classical education. I think in other forms of schooling, there's certainly going to be, like in a 7th grade history class at any other school, they're going to cover a lot of really good, eras and so on. I just feel like in a classical program, one that really tries to conserve the intellectual inheritance of the Western tradition, the very best literary and philosophical texts, works that were worth copying by monks in some very dark basement of a monastery. It's those sorts of books that we try to elevate and to give a certain pride of place in a classical program. And so, the number of transformative ideas that a student can come in contact with over the course of a school year at a classical program, I feel is what separates, classical education from other like modes of schooling and so forth. The On top of that too, up until the 1920s, what we call classical education today really was education, back then. The it is the education that molded the founding fathers. So the book lists that those individuals would recommend to their sons and grandsons is by and large the same book list that most classical schools have part of their have as their text list. Abraham Lincoln famously didn't read a whole lot of books as far as like the sheer number of books, but the books that he did read, he read very deeply and very intently. And so he came to master those particular works in a way that people who had read a lot more books never really came to master. I think the number of books that I'm sure he read more than this, but whenever you hear, it's always the King James Version of the Bible, Shakespeare, Aesop's Fables. When he wanted to learn how to become a lawyer, he didn't even get like a law book. He got Euclid's Elements as well as Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. So at least I'm sure there's more there, but I just counted 6. Those are usually the ones that are like the ones that Lincoln had on his shelf. It's not a lot, but he read those books very deeply and intently. And it's the same sort of thing that we want to bring out in a classical program. The other part of it is, the goal of classical education is to contribute in a positive way to the character, to the formation of students. So, as you're reading these books, you're also pulling out, some moral that's constructive for them. They should go and practice charity, loving people for who they are as being made in the image of God, or perhaps something that's little like more prohibitive, right? You shouldn't go and do this because it's actually quite bad for you. You should stay within these boundaries because within those boundaries, you're really safe and living a more authentic human life. Just the object, the goal, the telos of a classical education is a student who can not only think well and write well, but they also just are well. Like, and that's a really bad play on words, I recognize, but they're capable of knowing what is good. They would rather choose what is good. And they're also capable of encouraging others to pursue what is good and noble and true too.
Hmm. That kind of goes back to the modes of persuasion, right? When you're
Mhm.
talking about the appeal to reason, the
Yeah.
appeal to and from character, like they have a good reputation, a good standing kind of in front of their audience, and then the appeal to the emotions, I
Yeah.
assume. Um, yeah, that's something that in my lifetime I hadn't really heard much about a classical education up until I was maybe 30 years old. I wasn't familiar with it. But like you said, it's kind of like maybe a resurgence of classical education in certain parts of the country, but in other parts of the country, it kind of always was for some people. So
I
I
think they were
suppose,
just holding on to it.
yeah. So we've had kind of an introduction to what rhetoric is, and we talked a lot about Aristotle. And you helped write Research and Writing, the book that I'm holding right now for Thales Press. Um, Would you tell our listeners a little bit about this book as a resource for classical students or anybody who's interested in developing their rhetorical skills?
Oh, certainly. So that book we use in our ninth grade Humane Letters, which is what we're with that particular class in that particular book. We want to teach students the skills in order that they need to become great writers. So every chapter in that book, there's 12 chapters overall, but every chapter has 3 components to it. The first is a grammar lesson because students really need to master the elements, the essentials of sentence structure, uh, punctuation rules, capitalization rules, those sorts of things that you need if you're going to be understood whenever you write something. The second is a writing lesson. And that writing lesson touches on things like thesis statements or writing compare and contrast essays, cause and effect essays. Perhaps it's the steps of the research process and what you should do when you go about writing a research paper. So there's kind of like some practical bare bones, like how do you go about like structuring an essay? And the last component is a primary source that is integrated into the writing lesson, sometimes the grammar lesson. But the idea is to, remind students what the rules are of good writing, because most students just need those sorts of reminders, commas and capitalization, some of the obscure times that you use a comma or you don't use a comma, if that rule is going to sink in, you just have to see it tons of times. So there's the reminder, grammar lesson followed by some exercises. The writing lesson that gives a little bit more information on how to structure your thoughts. And then the primary source is really meant to provide an example of what really great writing looks like, so that students can model their own writing off of the very best writers that have come before them. Sometimes the text that's chosen, it fits exceptionally well with the particular writing lesson or the grammar lesson. There's a section on poetry, and I took Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses. So the grammar lesson is actually on verbals, so gerunds and participles and infinitives. And at the end of Tennyson's poem, Ulysses closes it with this great line, that really gets at the heart of the potential of man to potentially do good things, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. He closes it with 3 infinitives, right, which kind of gets at the infinite potential that students have. Not quite infinite, but they have a lot more choices before them than I do at this point. But I paired that poem with their lesson on verbals and infinitives, because I just really wanted the kids to see how a grammar lesson that probably seems really obscure can actually be incredibly important when you're trying to make a point in a poem, the way that Tennyson does at the end of Ulysses. I really love that. I had a teacher in high school that pointed out Tennyson's usage of infinitives, and I always thought it was so brilliant. So I try to pour that back into the book there to try to share those sorts of insights with other educators and students.
That's great. That's in volume 1, section 2, adapting your writing, correct?
Yeah, that's in section 2. I just tried to get these books as cheap as possible. So if we put, it's meant to be, each volume is a semester's worth of material.
Okay.
So volume 1 is 6 chapters. And in our school, those 6 chapters would take you through the whole semester. So volume 2 is the second semester. I was just trying to get it as cheap as possible for anybody interested in it. And I have free PDFs as well that I'd be happy to send.
That would be great.
I
could link those maybe in the notes, and then I could link this resource as well as your other volumes, because you have volume 1 and volume 2. So I'm going to put both of those links in the show notes so we can access that. That's fascinating though. And I like how you have just such a diverse primary source text list here. You have Plato's Apology, Aristotle's Rhetoric. You have some of these unfortunately I've never heard of, but I would be interested in reading William Shakespeare's Henry V, just because we just studied that in history. So that's fascinating. And just seeing what you pull from that, when you're teaching rhetoric. So thanks for sharing that tool with us.
Yeah, the rhetorical appeal, the emotional appeal that he uses is just so wonderful. He makes them, he talks to his soldiers like they were his friends, like his brothers. and if you're going to endure the great sacrifices of warfare and battle,
Yeah.
like that's what you want your king to be. You want the king to be at your side fighting with you.
Yeah.
It's just a great speech. I like that play an awful lot.
And I think they have didn't a movie come out a few years back, a Henry V movie?
They did release one with Timothy Chalamet or something. I can't pronounce his name. The really good one is with Kenneth Branagh. So the other one is with Kenneth Branagh, and back in maybe the 40s or even maybe even early that, but they Orson Welles directed a movie called Chimes at Midnight. That is Henry IV Part One and the Merry Wives of Windsor. But that's another really good play there as well. I'm sorry, not play, but movie. Chimes at Midnight.
All right. We'll have to check that out. So speaking of just books and, things that you enjoy with your family, I know that you have three boys right now, and I know you read to them because I've seen you read to them, and I know they love certain things. I think your son Hunter, he's mentioned some of the fun books that you guys read together. And then your middle son, he can't be that old. He's 4 years old. He said the other day, "Give me liberty or give me death." So I know that you've been teaching them well, and interspersing some, getting some history lessons in there and Latin lessons in there when you can. Which read aloud has been especially delightful or impactful to you and your children? And why has this been such a good book to read together?
The book that we like reading together a lot is the Action Bible, which is it's effectively a comic book that, I mean, really, really good, engaging illustrations. Um, it's written by Sergio Carlio. Just reading the name online. That's a book that the cover is very worn at this point. I guess it's not quite a read aloud book, but that's certainly the one we always go back to. Um, Historically, the favorite in our house has been the Little Blue Truck. I think I've memorized that at this point and could say it with my eyes closed or read it with my eyes closed. And then a recent favorite, read aloud favorite, has been Dr. Seuss's I Wish That I Had Duck Feet. So if you've never read that, that's a really fun one to read too. A kid who I think is having a hard time at school wonders what life would be like if he had duck feet, if he had deer antlers, if he had a long, long tail, and if he had a long, long nose. And then he wonders what life would be like if he had all those things put together. And he comes to the realization that all the things that he thinks are going to make his life better are actually kind of bad and have unintended consequences he didn't foresee at the time that he wanted them. And the very end of the story, the very last page, he realizes that he just wants to be like himself, and he throws all of that in the trash. So I think that's a great, great book in this day and age. Everybody thinks that there's something so wrong with them that they have to make radical changes to their life in some way, shape, or form. And I love how even Dr. Seuss hit at like these things that you think are going to make you happy, are probably going to make you lose your humanity, right? If you get an elephant's nose instead of a human nose, you kind of cease to be human, and so forth. But that's a really fun one. And the language is just so great. Rhyme schemes, really fun, bouncy rhythm. Dr. Seuss really knew what he was doing. That's a good one.
He did. And children, that sticks with them. They remember that. They can just recite that off the cuff. And just that sounds like a really interesting way to, drive home a deep truth in kind of that format for a young child. I like that. How you still, want to make sure you're feeding them the good stuff too. So I like that, how you have that on your list. And you don't necessarily think some of the children's books like Dr. Seuss, I love the rhyme scheme and the language and all of that, but sometimes you forget the deeper message behind all of that. So it's neat how, that that can be talked about after you read to them, and you can have discussions about it and kind of weave that into your everyday conversation. So I like that. Very neat. Well, Winston, we are almost out of time, but I wanted to give you a chance to tell our listeners where they can find you on the internet, and in your publishing journey and all of that. What would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, the best place to find materials that I help put together would be at thalesacademy.org. There's a page on there for resources, and it's listed some books that we've put out. Not all of them. We're making a lot of books for use in our program, as well as more kind of popular works of literature. Things that people coming out of a classical program, I think, would like to read. But it also has webinars that we put together and conference talks. So that would probably be the best place, thalesacademy.org/resources. And on that page is a handful of different pages for books Thales Press has put out, and webinars and short videos and things like that. So
Great. Thank you. I know our listeners are going to enjoy just looking over that. And I myself have really enjoyed listening to the podcast, Developing Classical Thinkers. That's been a great one for me. I've learned so much just in listening to you and the other professionals that you've interviewed who are, talking about what it's like to teach children. And, I think that some people might have, kind of a surface understanding of um, classical education. I myself did, a few years back, and I think that I'm still learning. And so this is a great way to like keep learning and keep your mind kind of thinking about the way that children learn, the way students learn, and the way adults learn, because everyone here. And I gather that it's kind of at your school, this you have this atmosphere of learning like alongside one another, and you do have a leader, of course, the teacher, but you're all learning, and there's this discussion and just a great environment to be in. So thank you for sharing about what you have written and what your colleagues have written, and thank you for answering my questions today about rhetoric and Socratic seminar and all those topics we touched on today. I appreciate it, Winston.
well, thank you so much for having me. And it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Winston.